Massive moves are coming for the New York Islanders this offseason, especially considering the team is in the middle of hiring a new GM. The next GM of the New York Islanders is going to want to put their stamp on the team, and their first opportunity to do that will be the NHL buyout window. In this episode of Islanders Digest, we're going to break down an article that talks about 3 different candidates who are likely to be bought out by the New York Islanders. We're going to discuss whether or not it makes sense to buy out each of these candidates and what the consequences for buyouts are, because they definitely can have a negative impact on the future of the New York Islanders. Before we get into that, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Be one of our first 100 subscribers. If you're an Islander fan and you want more Islanders content like this, especially in this offseason where so much is going to change for the New York Islanders, you're not going to want to miss anything. Be sure to subscribe. Now let's get right into this article by Eyes on Isles. Definitely recommend you check out the full article, because the article has kind of a different take on the buyouts and whether or not they would be a good idea. As you know, if you're a subscriber to the channel, I'm a little hesitant when it comes to buyouts, and while it definitely can make sense, I tend to try to avoid buyouts at all costs just because there are long-term ramifications. With that, let's get into the first candidate listed in this article, which is Anthony Duclair, who frankly had an absolutely brutal season for the New York Islanders, a season that he did not even finish, taking a leave of absence after he had a disagreement with coach Patrick Roy. Patrick Roy called him out for frankly playing terrible hockey. Did not use the best words in that call out, but everything he said was right. I mean, just look at the stats. 44 games for Anthony Duclair, a player who was brought in to be a top 6 player and really contribute offensively. Only had 7 goals, 4 assists for 11 points. His play was not good. Sure, Anthony Duclair did get hurt. Even when he came back, he was dealing with a lingering injury, which makes this decision interesting, because perhaps it might make more sense to keep Anthony Duclair at least one season to see if he bounces back. Still, we're going to take a look at the buyout numbers, especially with the new GM, a GM who did not sign Anthony Duclair, who didn't sign any of these players in the first place. There is a much better chance now that there'll be a buyout than when we previously made this video, assuming Lou Lamoriello would make these decisions. It's always a lot less likely that a GM is going to buy out a contract that they signed, but especially with a new GM coming in, a lot of times new GMs will buy out players to bring in their own guys. And by buying out Anthony Duclair, the Islanders both save a roster spot and $2.3 million for the next 3 seasons. But as I talked about in the beginning of this video, there is also a consequence. After those 3 seasons, for the next 3 seasons, the Islanders will lose $1.16 million on the salary cap that they cannot use to sign another player. These are the consequences that come with buyouts. And granted, $1.16 million in the scope of the NHL, which salary cap is going up $10 million per season for the next 3 years, is not that much money. Sure, it's a lot of money for you or me, but for these NHL teams that have so much money to spend, this is not going to make a big difference when it comes to either bringing in a free agent or really affecting the roster at all. But again, we have 3 players we are going to talk about in this video, and if you buy out all 3 of them, while in short term it can add up in terms of saving money for the Islanders to spend on a big fish, it can also cost you down the line. Now, one thing we do have to talk about with Anthony Duclair, with his leave of absence in the end of the season, we actually have no confirmation on what's going to happen next for the New York Islanders. Typically, you would never picture a player deciding to mutually terminate their contract with a team, but this is definitely, while a long shot, a possibility with the New York Islanders, especially if he cannot mend his relationship with Patrick Roy, and Patrick Roy remains the coach of the New York Islanders, because as of right now, Patrick Roy is still coach. The new GM, on top of having to decide which of these players to buy out or keep, will also have to decide whether to keep Patrick Roy. And frankly, we don't know if they can coexist in the same locker room anymore. I mean, taking a leave of absence for the end of the season is serious, and especially considering we have not had him come out and just explain that he was feeling hurt and just needed time to reflect, both physically and mentally, and just needed time to reflect. We still haven't gotten any of that, so there's definitely a possibility that happens, and in which case, the Islanders will not have to worry about this contract on the books, and they will not have to buy it out, which would honestly be... I don't want to say it's the best case scenario, because you definitely have concern for what's going on in Anthony Duclair's life. I wish him the best. But in terms of a salary cap perspective, that would mean the Islanders would just have all $3 million of the contract to spend elsewhere for a player who potentially can do what Anthony Duclair could not do. Now, the next player on this list is Scott Mayfield, and I think Scott Mayfield is a really interesting player on this list. Fans absolutely despise what Scott Mayfield did this offseason, but if you look at the stats, a plus 18, I know plus minus is not the best stat in the NHL, but plus 18 in 66 games, clearly Scott Mayfield is not the reason the Islanders were giving up too many goals. Now, you could argue he's not helping offensively. 3 goals, 6 assists, yeah, was not a big factor offensively, but this is a defenseman who clearly can still play defense, because if he was getting skated around and dangled as much as fans are saying he is, he would have a minus 18, which he doesn't. And for some teams that overvalue that plus 18, I really wonder if Scott Mayfield is actually a candidate to get traded. Perhaps instead of buying him out and facing the penalty, because with Scott Mayfield, there are several years left on his contract, which will both make it difficult to trade him and more costly to buy him out. You could also see a team, especially a team that is desperate for defense in this market this offseason, which is really not good for adding anything, but especially defense. Perhaps a team takes a shot on Scott Mayfield, and perhaps it makes more sense for the Islanders. As you can see, buying out Scott Mayfield for the next 5 years, they get $2.3 million a season, but then after that, you cut that number in half, and then for the next 5 years, the Islanders are losing 1.16 something, 1.166, I believe it is, million dollars for the next 5 years. That will go all the way into 2035. Sure, it's only $1 million a year. That's definitely a handicap you don't want to put on the franchise, especially as I was kind of hinting at before. Perhaps I don't think any team will take Scott Mayfield at $3.5 million. But again, when you buy out Scott Mayfield, you don't get $3.5 million back. You get 2.3. So perhaps if the New York Islanders eat that 1.16, they can trade Scott Mayfield for a team who's willing to take him on for 2.3. Probably won't get assets for it, but you can get rid of the contract without risking your long-term future. Doubt you would get assets in this trade, but who knows with this defensive market, especially with several teams about to get eliminated from the Stanley Cup playoffs because their defense has been horrendous. Scott Mayfield, tall guy who can clearly hold it down in the defensive end, might get more appreciation from other teams than with the Islanders. And who knows, maybe it makes sense, and honestly, it could make sense for the Islanders' new GM with all these players to see how they look for another year before making a decision. One thing I do want to point out, with all these buyout penalties, every year you wait before buying them out, it's one less year you have to deal with the penalty in the future. For example, if the Islanders are not going to be competitive next season, say the plan, and we don't know this, but say the plan is for the Islanders to bottom out, go all in for Gavin McKenna, then in that case, keeping Scott Mayfield would actually make it so the Islanders, if they do buy him out the following season or 2 seasons later, once the Islanders think they're ready to compete again, they would then only have to deal with the consequences for 3 seasons. Something you definitely have to keep in mind, because it's likely that these years where these players are going to be costing you in their buyouts are years where the Islanders are going to be looking to be competitive again after a retool or rebuild, whatever the next GM decides to do. The final player we have to talk about, and perhaps the most interesting, is Pierre Engvall. Now, what's interesting about Pierre Engvall is in the first half of the season, it was clear he's going to get bought out. His play was abysmal, like Anthony Duclair. But then Pierre Engvall picked it up, and in the last 10 games, he showed he can still be 35-point Pierre Engvall. And this is another point I want to bring up. When you're buying out a player, you're not just saving that entire amount of money. You do also have to find a player to replace them in the roster. And that's where Pierre Engvall really gets interesting. If you look at the buyout penalty for Pierre Engvall, again, only 8 goals, 7 assists, but he did a lot of that at the end of the season, and he was also playing really physical, showing for the first time in his career that he can potentially be a 3rd or 4th liner, and he doesn't have to stay in the top 6. Because yes, Pierre Engvall in the top 6 is a disaster. The Islanders tried it. It did not work. Perhaps bottom 6 Pierre Engvall provides value, more value than another player that you would sign for $2 million to replace him, because you have to put another player in the roster. And ideally, you just bring up a kid who is currently on a 3-year ELC who makes minimum in the NHL. But the Islanders really don't have that many of those. And for $2 million that you'd be saving for Pierre Engvall, if Pierre Engvall can give you that 35 points he put up back on Toronto, and really that half a point per game that he put up with that first season on the New York Islanders, or even the 28 points he put up the season before. Perhaps that's worth more than $2 million, especially if he can prove that he can play a bottom six role. Now, one thing I do want to mention with all these players, individually, you have to really question whether or not it makes sense to buy them out. Because again, you're with each player, you're really saving $1 or $2 million here, and you're eventually going to lose that money in the future. And I think part of this does really depend on whether or not the new GM wants to have roster spots for other players. And the other factor we do have to keep in is while buying one or two of them does not really save too much money, when you buy out all three of them, $2 million plus $2.3 million plus $2.3 million adds up to $6.6 million. All three of those together, perhaps there is a big fish free agent, and that money, when added to the money the Islanders already do have in the salary cap, could add up to a big fish. If not this year, perhaps the new GM waits a season until they see a big fish. Next free agency, as of right now, as we always know, these guys, a lot of them tend to resign, but right now it's looking pretty good. That is definitely an option to keep in mind, and something the Islanders next GM is definitely going to have to consider. I'd love to know in the comments, what are your thoughts on all this? Do you want to see one of these players get bought out, or do you want to see the Islanders buy out all three of these contracts, just get them off the roster? Let me know in the comments below. As always, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. My name is Patrick Nilan. This is Islanders Digest. Let's go, Islanders.